imagine, alive with sirens and a reminder that the nation will pay respects to a president who has died. John Roberts is our chief White House correspondent and live with us. These sorts of days are reminders of the power and the respect in that place.
Yeah, and just returning from the G20 in Argentina, it's really interesting to note the difference between when an American president travels, and travels anywhere, whether it's within Washington, D.C., or whether it's outside of the country, compared to other leaders. I mean, maybe the closest you get would be the Russian president or the Chinese president, but the number of vehicles that it takes just to transport the president's entourage. And again, here we have, well, that's the vice president's motorcade. You can see there, judging by the types of vehicles that are included in it. Yes, and he did just arrive because he'll be speaking at the Capitol. But just the difference in the power of the American presidency compared to other nations around the world, Chet, really is quite something. We talked about the type of person that George H.W. Bush was, and we talked about the 1992 campaign and how rancorous that got at times. And I remember quite vividly then Vice President Bush calling Bill Clinton and Al Gore bozos, and seemed quite upset at the prospect that they might beat him in the election. But then when Bill Clinton came into the Oval Office after the inauguration on January 20th, 1993, he found a letter from President Bush. And the letter wrote, "Dear Bill, when I walked into this office just now, I felt the same sense of wonder and respect I felt 4 years ago." This is as he's leaving the Oval Office. "I know you will feel that too. I wish you great happiness here. I never felt the loneliness some presidents have described. There will be very tough times, maybe even more difficult by criticism you may not think is fair. I'm not a very good one to give advice, but just don't let the critics discourage you or push you off course. You will be our president when you read this note." And listen to this. This was after this long and rancorous 1992 campaign. George Bush wrote, "I wish you well. I wish your family well. Your success now is our country's success. I'm rooting hard for you. Good luck." From the outgoing president to the incoming president, words of, "You are now my president, and I wish you good luck. I'm rooting for you." That's the type of person he was, Chef.
A good example for all of us. John, thanks. The former president's body arriving now at the Rotunda. The motorcade continues, and the former president's body will arrive on Capitol Hill for a final time in just a moment. And our coverage on Fox News Channel continues on Your World with Neil Cavuto.
Welcome to Fox News Channel's continuing coverage, remembering President George H.W. Bush. I'm Brett Baer in Washington.
And I'm Martha McCallum. Coming up on our special programming, the casket carrying the body of the 41st president will arrive at the United States Capitol. There will be a ceremony in which the casket, which was flown from Washington to Washington today, rather, from Houston, Texas, will then be carried into the Capitol Rotunda.
President Bush's remains will then lie in state, and there'll be a program with remarks by several political figures, including the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, House Speaker Paul Ryan, and Vice President Mike Pence.
We will also hear music this afternoon from the U.S. Naval Academy Glee Club. The public will be allowed to pay their respects as Mr. Bush lies in state through Wednesday morning. An invitation-only funeral service will be held Wednesday morning, 11 o'clock at Washington National Cathedral. The president will be then returned to Houston to lie in repose at St. Martin's Episcopal Church, his lifelong parish, before the burial, which will be Thursday at his family plot on the grounds of the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library and Museum in College Station.
We're waiting for the motorcade to arrive at the Capitol. As you take a look at the scene there on the south side of the Capitol, you can see some of the dignitaries arriving. We just saw the former Secretary of State, former Chief of Staff, James Baker, who we heard those poignant memories of the last moments of President George H.W. Bush's life, in which he called Baker Bake, and Jim Baker called President 41 Hefe, and the president said, "Where are we going, Bake?" And Baker turned to him and said, "Hefe, we're going to heaven." And those memories really set, over the weekend, a lot of emotions in action.
What a friendship, right? To be able to say that to your friend in that moment, and the president, former President 41, responded along the lines of, I'm ready, you know, and I think that we've thought a lot about the way that he got to the end of his life over the past few days, watching all of your coverage, Brett, over the weekend, and there's been a lot of reflection, but we're really just beginning the process of saying goodbye to this president.
You know, John Meacham, historian and biographer for the 41st president, said that this is a melding, a merging of the majesty of state and all of this pomp and circumstance with the humility of the man, this man, the 41st president. And he didn't ever really want to make it about him, ever. But this is about him, and everyone is remembering the 41st president as you look live inside the Capitol Rotunda. Let's bring in our panel. Byron York, Chief Political Correspondent of the Washington Examiner. Mara Liasson, National Political Correspondent of National Public Radio, and Washington Post columnist Mark Thiessen. Mark?
Mark, let's start with you.
Yeah, you know, it's been an amazing day watching this unified national celebration of the life of George H.W. Bush. He called us to be a kinder, gentler nation, and sadly we are far from that ideal today. And truth be told, our politics has never been that kind or gentle. But perhaps just for a few days, we can live up to the ideal of America that he wanted us to be. Perhaps for a few days we could have a few days without partisan bickering, without personal insults, without outrage, and just celebrate the grace and generosity and gentleness of this good man. And if we can do that, what a parting gift he's given us.
Mark?
Yeah, and you know, one of the things that George H.W. Bush really exemplified was that the people that he ran against or fought against in policy matters were his opponents, not his enemies. And he was as tough as they come in political campaigns. I mean, we all know about Willie Horton, but he was, once the campaign was over, he was a decent person. So I think he really did set a good example. I have one little memory of my own. I covered Congress at the time when he was the president. I didn't cover the White House, but I did have the honor of sitting next to him at the White House at the Radio and TV Correspondents Association's dinner. I was on the board then. And he showed me a press pass, a fake press pass that the White House photographers had made him because they loved him so much and he was so affectionate with them that they made him an honorary White House photographer. And I love that picture.
You know, I think the next few days are going to be an opportunity to reflect not just on him, not just on his 4 years in the White House, but really on these momentous events of our history. If you live 94 years, you really do cover a lot. And here you have the last president who served in World War II to be president. The Cold War just played an enormous role in his life and the ending of it in his presidency. He lost in 1992 to a baby boomer, the first boomer to become president, and there's still presidents today. He was part of this enormous war, and inside the Republican Party. He was on the moderate side in 1980, the divisions inside the Republican Party between the conservatives led by Ronald Reagan and the moderates led in part by George H.W. Bush was just huge. So he's played an enormous role in all of these things. And there are all of these well-deserved tributes to his character. But he's also just such a big figure in everything that has shaped our country for the last almost century.
We're looking live at the hearse and the motorcade arriving at the U.S. Capitol. There you see it'll be met at the stairs, and there'll be a solemn ceremony taking it up to the Capitol Rotunda that will bring you full coverage of here as well as that ceremony. Let's bring in former George W. Bush Senior Advisor Karl Rove with some thoughts. Karl, you know, as we look at this arriving and you hear all of the media reflecting on these positive memories of the 41st president, you also have to remember that, you know, he didn't really think the media treated him that fairly. Back in the day, I had a message from Rob McDowell, former FCC commissioner who worked on the campaign, and he sent me this bumper sticker. It says, "Annoy the media, re-elect Bush." And he said, and you see the inscription on the bottom, "This is my favorite," and it was the country's favorite too. Talk about that, and kind of as we reflect on the 41st president's life.
Well, he didn't think that he was well treated by the press in the 1992 campaign, and that bumper sticker appeared late in the campaign, and President Bush, 43, took a special delight in it. On the other hand, like it was observed earlier, he never thought of his political opponents as his enemies, and he never thought the press, no matter how badly he thought they treated him, as his adversaries. They had their job, he had his job. So I thought Mark Thiessen put his finger on it earlier. This is the 9th president to lie in state in the Capitol. The first was Lincoln. The last one was in 2006 with Gerald Ford. And in between, we've had Garfield and McKinley and Harding and JFK and LBJ and Ronald Reagan. These are moments when the country comes together and looks more at what draws us together as Americans than what divides us, and more what we ought to strive for rather than what we are. And it's a great moment, almost of a civic religion, where we come together and participate in the same ceremony, and it's good for the country to do so, and it's particularly good to do so when such a very good man is the object of our thoughts today.
Yeah, absolutely, Karl. And, you know, any death causes one to pause. And I think the death of a president causes the nation to pause. And you reflect on the era that that person represents and the history that they lived, and then also the period of time after, in this case, they were president. We still are a relatively young country. We've only had 45 of these individuals in office. So when this happens, we do all come together. And we reflect on where we are as a nation. You look at these faces, we all remember them for so many years by the side of President Bush 41. And let me bring in Dana Perino, host of the Daily Briefing, co-host of The Five, and former press secretary for President George W. Bush. Dana, your thoughts as we watch this at the Capitol?
Well, listening to you and actually having been with all of you during this past year, there's been a lot of loss, right? So Barbara Bush, who died in April. We lost our own Charles Krauthammer in June. There was the death of Senator John McCain, and now that of President George H.W. Bush. And I think that it does show that, you know, Americans do take a moment to pause, and we might, it's like one of those things that they used to say in Washington, that you fought like heck during the day, and then you went and had a beer afterwards, as we watched the hearse come here to the Capitol before the family is going to receive the casket there at the Capitol. The other thing I've been thinking about, Martha and Brett, is that this is a family who's had a lot of loss this year by losing the matriarch of their family, and then their poppy, their Gamps, George H.W. Bush. And they grieve for him as children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, daughters-in-law, sons-in-law, and yet they have to share these moments with us as a nation, and I admire their ability to allow us a chance to be a part of this, because it's intensely personal, but of course the world is watching as well.
He would call people up and say, "This is 41." After his son obviously was president. There you see John Sununu, his former White House Chief of Staff, other members of the administration, and Vice President Dick Cheney, who served as Secretary of Defense. Obviously, next to him is James Baker as the hearse arrives. Let's check in quickly with Chief Congressional Correspondent Mike Emanuel, who's at the Capitol this afternoon. Mike?
Brett and Martha, good afternoon to you. A very solemn mood out here on the east front of the Capitol. The lighting appears to be appropriate for such a day. Getting a little dark here, a little cloudy as we await the casket of former President George Herbert Walker Bush. We can see former Vice President Dan Quayle and members of the Bush 41 cabinet up at the top of the steps awaiting the arrival of the 41st president. We've got color guard of all the service branches out waiting for him. There will be 21-gun salute and ruffles and flourishes, and so a really all-American gathering for the consummate all-American president who had every major job, it seems like, in this town at one point or another. And so we await the arrival to go up the steps very slowly, very orderly, to make the way into the Capitol, where we know that United States senators, past and present, are waiting for him in the Capitol Rotunda. We expect House members as well. Members of the Supreme Court are in there, and so we are about to see a very all-American tribute here at the U.S. Capitol. Brett, Martha?
This does not happen often. And when it does, it requires probably as little talking as you could do. So we're going to listen in as much as we can and let you hear what's happening right there on the east side of the Capitol. solemn ceremony as they wait for the casket to move up those stairs, Martha. There you see the remains of the 41st president. You saw the grief on President 43, George W. Bush's face as they walked in. You also saw it on Air Force One, Special Mission 41, flying from Houston.
You know, much was said about 41's inability to be a great communicator. He talked about how Reagan was such a far superior communicator, and yet in the later years of his life, I think we got to know him as such an excellent communicator and someone who had written such beautiful letters. And the emotion that we have seen over these years between Bush 41 and 43, I think, has just been a lovely lesson for everyone to take in, because these, you know, tough guys, presidents of the United States, were so open about their love and affection for each other, and you clearly saw that etched on 41's face as he gets back to Washington, comes back to where so much of their lives together was spent, and when you see this pomp and circumstance and the magnitude and the gravity of it, it's awe-inspiring and no doubt overwhelming to some extent.
You know, one of the things that 43 used to tell us when I worked for him in the White House is that I was with him at the end of the administration, and he would tell us that history's verdict takes a long. He was very calm about his place in history because history's verdict takes a long time to come in. One of the advantages of living to the age of 94 is that you get to live to see history's verdict come in. And a lot of the things that we take for granted today about how history unfolded over the last quarter century were the handiwork of George H.W. Bush. We take for granted that the Soviet Union collapsed peacefully without a shot being fired. This was the most heavily armed empire in human history. And that was his management of the end of the Soviet Union. We take for granted that Germany is united in a single country, and that happened without a hitch going forward. That was incredibly hard work to make that happen. We take for granted that we were able to protect the Middle East from a massive invasion by Iraq. That was an incredibly hard challenge to meet. So, you know, there's a young generation now that really didn't live through these experiences, doesn't understand the collapse of the Soviet Union, doesn't even remember the Soviet Union. And the beauty is that they're getting a history lesson right now about this era of politics and how these things don't just happen. They require leadership.
President Bush 43 there with the family. That shot, just look at that shot. I think the pool will maybe go back to it. And that is the sunset, looking out the east side of the Capitol. To the left of the screen, the U.S. Supreme Court. To the right, the Library of Congress. That is the majesty of Washington at its best. As the sun sets on a beautiful day and the 41st president's remains are there getting ready to make the journey into the Capitol Rotunda, where he will lie in state, and members of the public after this ceremony will be able to come in and shuffle through. And Chad Pergram, our senior producer up on Capitol Hill, said the amazing thing about these moments, Mara, is that when that happens, the silence of the Capitol Rotunda, the shuffling of hundreds of feet going past the caskets is at one point eerie, but also really respectful.
Really respectful. And I think what you said, you know, this is a time that calls for as little talking as possible, because everyone in the nation can partake of this. And if they want to go to the Capitol and stand in line, they can do that too. And, you know, something that Mark just said, I think history is treating George H.W. Bush pretty well already. You know, where are we now? We're supposedly at a time where the Republican Party that he represented has been obliterated. But think again, NAFTA is still in place. His vision of what it should be, which is 3 countries, Canada, Mexico, and the United States, integrated through trade, still in existence. NAFTA's been updated but not obliterated. Certainly, every bit of foreign policy architecture he put in place is more or less paying off. So I think that George H.W. Bush has been, as people have said all day, probably the most consequential long-term president in terms of the lasting impact.
Let's listen back in.
Members of the president's cabinet entering the room. We can see Colin Powell, General Colin Powell, at the front of the line here, and John Sununu, who was the chief of staff, and now the close shot of Colin Powell, who you don't see all that much these days. He has retired to a quiet life, but obviously one of the central figures in the Iraq War during Bush 41's presidency.
And they'll all file in, as well as members of the House and Senate already inside. We should point out former senators as well, Bill Frist, others who are in attendance, who obviously have a big relationship with the 41st president.
I believe that's Senator Danforth towards the front of the line, and Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, and there's Andy Card sort of towards the back of the line there, as these faces which were very familiar during the Bush years gather for this moment.
Gordon Gray and others. I just want to reflect back on the shot outside and the weather tonight. You know, President Bush, 41, a naval aviator. On his 80th birthday, he said, Kabul, ceiling and visibility unrestricted, jumping out of a plane and a helicopter, best flying weather. For the sailors out there, red sky at night, sailors delight. This has been about as beautiful a night here in Washington as you can see. Let's listen back in. Let's bring in Juan Williams, co-host of 5, Fox News analyst. Juan, as you look at this, the pomp and circumstance, it's pretty much everything Washington can bring.
You know, what strikes me, Britt, as I'm watching is, of course, that we're honoring a war hero, a man who was shot down, a man who risked his life and lost much of his crew in the course of his military career. And what we're seeing now is Precision has performed, I think it's 4,000 military people, members of the joint headquarters for the Washington region, who will be involved in these ceremonies. And it is thoroughly appropriate not only for the Commander-in-Chief, George H.W., but for a man who put his life at risk for the United States of America, a man who served his country in so many important positions, not only as Vice President and President, but you might also recall envoy to China and head of the Central Intelligence Agency. What strikes me about this is, you know, this is America coming together in a way that is almost suggestive of pomp and circumstance of royalty. And he was very much resistant to any such suggestion, even though he was president and the father of President George W. Bush. But it's hard to get away from the idea that the Bush family stands apart at this moment in terms of what they represent to us as the American people.
Color Guard enters the Capitol Rotunda with the casket of the 41st President of the United States. You know, it's interesting to think back to his congressional career. His first run for the Senate was unsuccessful. He then went and became a congressman and found his way here to the Capitol building and began what was the beginning of his political life, becoming Vice President and President of the United States of America, and now he returns to the U.S. Capitol.
Let's listen in. his assassination.
We give you thanks, Almighty God, for the appearance among us of great men and women who serve as inspirations for all Americans to be their best in service to God, country, and neighbor. This day, we honor our 41st President, George H.W. Bush. President Bush dedicated his entire life to public service as a vocation, first in the military, then as a member of Congress, a diplomat, director of the CIA, vice president, and finally, president. It is a record of service reminiscent of John Quincy Adams and unmatched in nearly a century. We thank you, O God, for having endowed President Bush with noblesse oblige, and ask that his example of service to others might be an inspiration to all Americans, indeed to all the world. As we continue this celebration of honor, grant that all who attend to these proceedings might be desirous of being our best selves in service to all our brothers and sisters, as you might call us to be. Dear Lord, thank you for inspiring such greatness in President George H.W. Bush, and continue to bless the United States of America. Amen.
30 years ago, on the west front of this Capitol, George Herbert Walker Bush addressed the nation for the first time as our president. He said,